Hello everybody, this is TipTop MTG here today with another MTG Arena video. In today's video, we are going to be taking a look at all of the new to MTG Arena, or should I say new to Magic cards in Jumpstart Historic Horizons. So for those of you who don't know, this is an upcoming historic only set coming to MTG Arena, and with it comes 31 cards that have never been printed in Magic before and use digital only mechanics. Now, I talked about those specific mechanics on a video that I did Monday, so you guys should check those out if you don't know what they are. I'll do a brief explanation, but I'm not going to go in near as much depth as I did there. Either way, let's just jump into this as we do have a decent amount of cards to talk about. If you want to know my thoughts about the reprints coming into MTG Arena with this set, stay tuned for another video where I talk about some of the cards that I think are going to be most impactful and most interesting. Either way, let's jump into this. Starting off, we have Baffling Defenses. This is 1 and a white for an instant, and target creature's base power perpetually becomes 0. So essentially, you say, hey, this thing can't deal damage in combat. And it is an instant, so it is going to be a kind of combat trick. But the fact that it's perpetual is actually a pretty big deal. I don't think this is going to see a ton of play in Historic, as using, it to make one creature not really be able to attack isn't the best thing in the world, because it still can block, it can still activate its abilities. However, I think in Historic Brawl, this actually could be a really awesome card, because essentially if you cast this on your opponent's commander and their commander likes to deal damage, let's say it's something with Double Strike or something that likes to deal damage, you can essentially make it null and not be able to really attack. Or if your opponent's commander wants to hit you to do something, you can say actually it has 0 power. And so it is going to be a little situational, but if you do this on your opponent's creature, because it's perpetually, no matter where it ends up going, whether that's the graveyard, library, hand, command zone, it will keep that effect. So if you do this on your opponent's commander, it dies, they recast it, it stays 0. So that is something to keep in mind. I actually think this could see some play in Historic Brawl, and with that becoming a somewhat permanent queue, this could end up actually seeing more play than first expected. Next, we have Venalish Partition. It's 1 and a white for a creature, human soldier, 1/2, with lifelink. And it says, whenever you cycle another card, you may pay 1 and a white. If you do, return Venalish Partition from your graveyard to the battlefield, and battlefield tapped, and it perpetually gets +1/+0. So if you cycle this away, because it has cycling for 1 and a white, and then you cycled something else, and then you also paid 1 and a white, you get a 2/2 with lifelink for essentially 4 mana, but you also drew a card, so okay, that's not horrible. Then maybe it dies in combat, you cycle something else, it comes back and it's a 3/2. Honestly, this doesn't seem amazing to me. I would rather have the Fox that just gets a counter every time you cycle. I know this adds a little bit of resilience to the deck. That is kind of a problem with cycling decks. If you can just remove their stuff, their only win con is Zenith Flare. This adds another win con because it can keep coming back. Your opponents can keep removing it, and you can keep bringing it back. However, it is pretty costly. If this thing cycled for 1 mana, I would say it's a definite include. But the fact that it cycles for 2, and one of them is specifically colored, means this is gonna be okay. I could see some decks running it. I just don't know how well it's going to do. Next, we have Leonion Sanctifier. It's 1 and a white for a creature, cat cleric, 2/1 with lifelink, and when it enters the battlefield, choose a creature card in your hand, it perpetually gains lifelink. So 2/1 for 2 with lifelink isn't horrible. I mean, in 100 card Historic Brawl, which I'm going to keep going back to because a lot of these cards I think are going to do better in that format where you are going to need more cards. It's 100 cards and singleton. If you're in a life gain deck, you may need this. There might not be enough lifelinkers, and lifelinkers in life gain decks are pretty good. And then you can turn one of your big creatures that normally isn't a lifelinker into one. So it seems okay. Kind of reminds me of lifelink counters, but you're putting it into your hand instead of onto something on the battlefield. I think it'd be cool if it said choose a creature card in your hand or on the battlefield. I think that would make this super cool. But as it stands, it's not awful. You do need the right balance, though, of creatures with lifelink and creatures without it, because if you have a whole deck that cares about lifelinkers, and your whole hand has lifelink, this card essentially is just a 2/1 for 2 with lifelink, which isn't the best. Next, we have a Lumbering Light Shield. It's 1 and a white for a creature, illusion, 1/4, and it says, when it enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals a non-land card at random from their hand. It perpetually gains this spell costs 1 more to cast. So essentially, it's just going to cost 1 more to cast forever. That means if you bounce it back to their hand, say you're an Azorius, it's going to end up costing them 1 more the next time they want to play it. Seems fine. I think if you're in a deck that wants to flicker stuff, this could actually be really, really mean. We did just get Teleportation Circle in Adventures in the Forgotten Realm, which essentially flickers something on each end step. If you add this to an Azorius deck, you can take things like Thassa. I believe we're getting Soul Herder in Historic Horizons, which again at your end step flickers something. So we're going to have 3 different cards that flicker stuff at your end step. And this thing can get mean. I mean, it's not obviously the best flicker payoff, but it is definitely one that's going to make it harder for opponents to do stuff, especially when they start getting lower on cards and you make like their one spell cost like 3 more. So this doesn't seem horrible. It also doesn't seem like it's the best thing in the world. It is a common. Obviously, it's not designed to like break a format or be meta defining, but I don't think it's awful. Although I do have to say, the I forgot the name of it, the one from Strixhaven that's like a 3/1 flyer that you get to look at their hand, then choose something, and it essentially costs 2 more to cast, is in my opinion just better in almost every way. You get to see their hand, it costs 2 more to cast, you get to pick the card. So just keep that in mind when looking at this card, as there is almost a better option in standard. However, we have this card, Taiyo, Aegis Adept. It's a 4-cost legendary planeswalker Taiyo for loyalty, and it has a +1. Up to 1 target creature's base power perpetually becomes equal to its toughness. It perpetually gains. This creature can attack as though it didn't have defender. So if you have a 0 for a wall, and then you decide, oh, I'm going to +1 it, it permanently becomes a 4/4 without defender, essentially, even if Taiyo leaves the battlefield. Even if that wall gets bounced to your hand and you replay it. This is actually really, really cool, and if you are playing one of those, like, you know, defender matters / toughness matters decks, this is definitely going to go in it just for that one ability. Having more redundancy is going to be good in those decks. Then it has -2, conjure a Lumbering Lightshield card onto the battlefield. So that's going to be this card that we just talked about, which, by the way, is a 1/4. That if you can +1 it, it's essentially a 4/4. It doesn't have defender, so it could already have attacked, but a 4/4, you know, over the course of 2 turns, plus you are making your opponent's stuff more expensive, isn't awful. And then his -6 is an emblem. At the beginning of your end step, return target white creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. You gain life equal to its toughness, which, by the way, if something's returning to the battlefield, and let's say it was Lumbering Lightshield that you conjured, and then you made it a 4/4. And I know this is a lot of different things happening, but whatever, say it's a 4/4, because it was perpetually, that creature you're returning is still going to be boosted with Taiyo's +1. So it does have a little bit of synergy with itself there, so that's pretty cool. I like its emblem. It's not too hard to get off. You know, you play it, it's on 5, the next turn you get up to 6, so essentially 2 turns after the turn you play it, you can ult him if you want to sacrifice him. And that is a pretty powerful effect. It does obviously only target white creatures, so it's not like it's going to be able to fit in every deck, but in the right style of deck where you're caring about toughness, this is going to be pretty cool. Next, we have Winged Steed Trainer. It's a 4-cost white creature human, 2/3. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, conjure a Stormfront Pegasus card into your hand. All right, so this one on the battlefield, I would say this was a really crazy card. You're getting, you know, 4 power, 4 toughness for 4 mana. Well, that's not actually the case. You're getting 4 power, 4 toughness for 6 mana. However, whenever this thing attacks, you're essentially getting a card into your hand. Now, on attack, draw a card is not bad. Now, on attack, draw Stormfront Pegasus is not as good. However, that does mean you can be discarding them. It means you can be, you know, playing them and sacrificing them. So I think if you can get this thing to consistently attack, I think in the right deck, this thing can be a powerhouse. I mean, if you have something that lets you discard a card to do literally anything, whenever this thing attacks, you're getting free discard fodder. Or if you care about the number of cards in your graveyard, they're going to your hand, you discard it, now you have a ton of them. Maybe there's, I don't know, is there a card right now in MTG Arena that cares about the number of cards with the same name? If that's the case, this card's pretty cool because you're going to get a ton of Stormfront Pegasi? I don't know. It's other than that, it's okay. I think it feels like an uncommon. It's going to be powerful in a couple niche decks or niche decks, but it is going to not be super crazy. Next, we have Bounty of the Deep. It's a 3-cost blue sorcery. If you have no land cards in your hand, seek a land card and a non-land card. Otherwise, seek 2 non-land cards. Honestly, this seems really good to me. Okay, so think about this. Divination, 2 and a blue, you know, essentially draw 2 cards. This card is 2 and a blue, essentially draw 2 cards. Now, if you're casting this and you have no lands in your hand, you are going to get a land, which could be a downside. If you're late in the game, you have 7 lands, you top deck this, whatever, you're getting a land. unfortunate. But you're always getting at least something else. So this is at least cycling itself. However, this also means that turn 3, if you draw this, a divination, you're drawing 2 cards. Yes, you're likely to hit a land, but what if you don't? This one guarantees that you're going to get that land drop. And so this actually means you might be able to play less lands in your deck if you, for instance, trade out a divination. The big issue here is, are you running divination? So I think this is going to be a card we see a little bit more in Historic Brawl. But I do not think it's a bad card. I think it's an interesting use of Seek, where it's essentially divination, but you can have a little bit of choice. It almost reminds me of Abundant Harvest, where you get to choose land or non-land, except you have just a little bit less control. And also, you can manipulate this. Say turn 4, you draw a land, and you have this in your hand, right? You could choose, if you wanted another land, to cast it while you have a land in hand, if you want to not get any more lands. And if you decide you want an extra land, you can play your land first and then cast Bounty of the Deep. So there's lots of really interesting play patterns I think this card creates. So while it's not the most powerful thing in the world, I think it's actually really, really interesting. Next, we have Ethereal Grasp. It's a 3-cost blue instant. Tap target creature. That creature perpetually gains. This creature doesn't untap during your untap step. And pay 8 mana to untap this creature. So essentially, this is a tap down effect that is not an enchantment. Normally, for 3 mana, you can tap something down and it doesn't untap as long as that enchantment is still enchanting it. This says essentially the same thing, but on an instant, which means it's instant speed, by the way, which is a major advantage. Oftentimes, when you want to go instant speed, it's either double blue or it gets 1 more expensive in mana. And then they can untap it with 8 mana. But you could say, oh, well, it's tapped down, and it is, but there are going to be those cases where you tap down their 10/10 double striking trampler. All they need to do is get to 8 mana and they win the game. So it is, definitely a solution. And again, you just need to think about it. You want to put it on a creature maybe that isn't going to just win the game if it ever untaps, but it's also good to keep it down. Something along those lines. But yeah, it can be untapped. But then again, what's more likely? Enchantment removal or having 8 mana? In my opinion, in most, historic games, probably enchantment removal, because getting up to 8 mana and using that just to untap a creature isn't great. Of course, there are going to be situations where you're going to want to do it, but I just generally think this card is interesting. It's another form of blue removal. It's an instant speed form. Enchantment removal doesn't destroy it, so that's kind of cool. And if you end up bouncing it and it re-enters the battlefield, it will enter the battlefield untapped, but it will still have that clause on it. So that is another thing to think about it. There have been times where I want to bounce all creatures to their owner's hands, but I'm enchanting some of their stuff with tap down effects, and so I'm essentially untapping them. And so this does get around that. So there are some pros and cons to this compared to the typical tap down aura enchantment. Next, we have Kiora the Tide's Fury. It's 3 and a blue for a 4 loyalty Kiora. You can +1 to conjure a Kraken Hatchling card into your hand. So that's a 1-cost 0/4. So pretty good, by the way, in the Taiyo deck, because it has high toughness. Either way, then you can +1 and untap target creature or land, prevent all damage that would be dealt to you and dealt by that permanent until your next turn. So this can be used in 30 different ways. You can untap a creature that you want for utility, or you maybe swing with something and then untap it so you can block with it. You can untap a land, so this is essentially ramp. You can untap an opponent's creature and essentially prevent it from dealing damage. You can untap one of your creatures to prevent it from taking damage. There are so many things that +1 can do. I think it's going to be good just for that. People played War of the Spark Kiora just because you could -1 to untap a land. And so I think the fact that this one is, yes, 1 mana more expensive, but you +1 to untap a land, and it can also do all these other things, I think it's actually really good. Then you can -3 and sacrifice a Kraken, which, by the way, Kraken Hatchling is a Kraken, if you do create it 8/8. So essentially you can turn the Hatchling into an 8/8, and actually she has enough loyalty to ult the turn she comes out. I mean, if you already have a Kraken or a Changeling or something, you can basically pay 4 mana for an 8/8 and have Kiora stick around. I think this card could have been more interesting if you started at 3 loyalty, where it's yeah, you can actually pay 4 mana to sack one of your creatures and turn it into an 8/8, or you can play a little bit slower, get the Hatchling, which ticks her up to 4, and then -3, getting the 8/8, letting her survive and do the little combo. But whatever, this is a more powerful version. And I don't think it's bad. I don't know how good it necessarily is, but, the ability to +1 to draw a card. Yes, you're drawing a very specific card, but again, we talked about this with the one that summons Stormwing Pegasi. This could be really good in specific decks. Next, we have Mentor of Evos Isle. It's a 3-cost blue creature, bird wizard, 2/1 with flying, and when it enters the battlefield, choose a creature card in your hand. It perpetually gains flying, so it's essentially the lifelink guy, but for flying, it's just kind of meh. Next, we have Shoreline Scout. It's 1 blue for a creature, Merfolk Scout, 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, you may exile a Merfolk card or land card from your hand. If you do, conjure a tropical island card into your hand. As long as another Merfolk or an island entered the battlefield under your control this turn, Shoreline Scout gets +1/+0. Honestly, this seems really good to me in a Simic deck, specifically a Merfolk Simic deck. Why? Okay, think about the play pattern of this. In your hand, say you start with your opening hand, you have 2 islands and Shoreline Scout and then a bunch of other stuff that requires some green. You play the first island, right? And then you play Shoreline Scout, exiling the island from your hand. Now you have a tropical island in your hand. So essentially you just upgraded your island into a tropical island. Okay, here's another situation. You draw this card and you need lands. It's going to be a 1-drop, so you should always be able to cast this. But you have a bunch of Merfolk in your hand and you just need to be able to get more land. So this can essentially just be a land in a Merfolk deck. You're going to get the creature and then you're going to sacrifice one of your Merfolk to get a land. And I think that's really, really good. And then it has the other ability to get bigger when Merfolk enter or islands enter, which is fine. It's not that huge of a deal. I just think that in those Merfolk decks, it's a 1-drop. It's a 1/1 for 1. Not bad. Gets bigger when Merfolk enter the battlefield. That's already what they want to do. And then it's also going to help fix you. And if you don't need that, if you just want the 1/1 for 1, you can also go for that. So I actually think in a Simic Merfolk deck, this is going to be a powerhouse early on, and just maybe even let you play a land less. If you're running like a play set of these, you might be able to run even 2 less. Next, so that Tropical Island, by the way, is just an untapped land that taps for blue or green. Also, you could maybe take a tapped land from your hand and turn it into Tropical Island, which then won't be tapped anymore. So lots of cool things you can do. Next, we have Tomo the Infinite. So I've talked about this one in the mechanics video because it has its own kind of special mechanic, but essentially it's a 3-cost legendary artifact that you can pay blue for and tap to conjure a random card from its spellbook into your hand. It perpetually gains. You may spend mana as though or mana of any color. So these are the 10 cards. I talked about them in the other video, so you should check those out, but essentially they're all 1-drops. Essentially, you're paying 2 mana to randomly cast one of these spells, but you don't have to do it at the time of activation. So you could get Force Spike, which is a counter spell, and, not cast it right away, or Dark Ritual and not cast it right away, and decide to wait. And actually, you do have to wait. For instance, if you activate it at sorcery speed, like on your opponent's turn, and you draw a sorcery, you have to wait till your next turn. But I really like it because a lot of the time, if they did this effect in paper, you'd have to cast it right there at that moment. But this one kind of just lets you, again, pay 1 mana to just add a card to your hand. And these are very, very useful spells. Yes, Assault Strobe and maybe even Light of Hope are not the best things in the world, but also blue can now destroy enchantments. Blue can deal 3 damage to any target. Blue can make opponents discard. Blue can fog. Blue can boost their creatures +3/+3. Blue can exile a creature. Like, blue can now do all this. It is random and you can't really control it, but I just want you to keep that in mind. Blue now has access to all of these effects. And honestly, I know I keep jumping to Historic Brawl, but I'm just excited for it to come out. This seems like one of those cards that I'm going to throw in every blue Historic Brawl deck. With it being a 100-card singleton, you have a lot more slots to fill, and I feel like this is one of those cards that's just pretty good and can fit in a lot of different shells and still provide a lot of value, because these are all kind of just value spells. Next, we have Boneyard Aberration. It's a 5-cost 3/3 creature, skeleton dog. When it dies, exile it. If you do, conjure 3 reassembling skeleton cards into your graveyard. So essentially, you get 3 of this guy, which they all have the ability to pay 2 black mana and return them from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So essentially, you're turning your 3/3 into 3 individual 1/1s that can all keep coming back. Reassembling Skeleton can be a powerhouse just because you can sack it, bring it back, and just generate a ton of value. So you can essentially sack Boneyard Aberration, then bring back 3 different creatures that can all be sacked. I like this card. It uses Conjure, in my opinion, very well, because in a paper format, those would be token creations. Like, it would say, oh, create 3 1/1 reassembling skeletons, but as soon as they died, they wouldn't hit the graveyard, so it wouldn't be super interesting. But this uses the graveyard and these quote unquote tokens, even though they're not, they're actually full on cards, very well. Next, we have Davriel Soul Broker. 4 mana, black, legendary planeswalker Davriel, 4 loyalty, +1 until your next turn. Whenever an opponent attacks you and/or planeswalkers you control, they discard a card. If they can't, they sacrifice an attacking creature. So just going to make you discard, pretty good. -2, accept one of davriel's offers, then accept one of his conditions. So essentially, you're going to be given 3 of the good effects at random, and you choose one, and then 3 of the bad effects at random, and you choose one. So this can vary. You know, sometimes you're going to activate this, and it's going to be amazing. Sometimes you're going to activate it, and it's going to absolutely suck. Then -3, target creature perpetually gets -3, -3. Now, I do want to say this card is going to be banned in Historic Brawl, which is unfortunate. It would have been fun, but the perpetually minus toughness is devastating to any commander that has 3 or less toughness, because then essentially you lock it out of the game for good. So I'm glad to see that it got banned. Overall, okay card. It's really only going to ever see play in Historic, because Historic Brawl, it's banned. And even there, I don't know how much it's going to see. Maybe in those discard decks, you might want it. But I think we really have to look at kind of the -2 and how much value you can generate from that before you can see how good this card is. Next, we have davriel's Withering. 1 black for an instant. Target creature perpetually gets -1, -2. By the way, same thing. This is banned in Historic Brawl, but it's a pretty interesting card. I actually think that it's good removal. But unfortunately, you know, I would say it's good removal in Historic Brawl, even disregarding the fact that it can hit commanders. I don't know how good it is, though, for Historic. -2 toughness for 1 mana, though, isn't bad, and you kind of have to look at the metagame and see what does that take out. Oh, it takes out Acolyte Phoenix. That instantly makes this card better. Think about it. In best of 3, if Acolyte Phoenix is running around Historic, which it is, this card basically says Acolyte Phoenix is dead because you kill it, and then it has -2 toughness in the graveyard, meaning that when it comes back to the battlefield, it immediately dies. So this answer, I think this will sit in sideboards just to counter Acolyte Phoenix in Historic. Next, we have Manor Guardian, 3 cost black creature demon for 3. And when it dies, each player seeks a non-land card with mana value 2 or less. So essentially, you're just getting a random card from your library with mana value 2 or less that is a non-land. And each player is doing it, so it's not that great. Effects that benefit you as much as benefit your opponent are not always the best. But then again, you are getting a 4/3 for 3, so you are technically getting the benefit there. And maybe your deck is built around it. For instance, maybe in a Lurrus deck, you could do, well, no, because Lurrus, this has 3 mana. So I don't know. It's okay. Not my favorite card. Next, we have Plaguecrafter's Familiar. This is essentially the lifelink guy and the flying guy, but for Death Touch. So when ETBs, choose a creature card in your hand, it gets Death Touch. It's fine. In a Death Touch tribal deck, it could be interesting just because it is a Death Toucher. We have more of them now, so that's pretty cool. Next, we have Subversive Acolyte. So it's black for a creature human 2/2. You can pay 2 and pay 2 life and choose 1, but you can only activate this once for the entire game on this card. Subversive Acolyte becomes a human cleric. It gets +1/+2 and gains lifelink. Subversive Acolyte becomes a Phyrexian. It gets +3/+3 and gains trample. And whenever this creature is dealt damage, sacrifice that many permanents. So essentially, it turns into one of the 2 things on the left and right. Now, it does not perpetually become this. So if you flicker it, bounce it, return it from the graveyard, it will let you re-choose what you want to do. Both are okay. I don't love the Phyrexian making me sacrifice permanents, but maybe if you're in a deck that likes sacrificing stuff, you might be able to get away with this. If it was, sacrifice a permanent, I would say that this card is really, really good. But because it's that many, it means that you could actually end up in a major blowout where you end up just sacrificing all of your lands, basically your whole board. And so it's very risky. And then the lifelink one, you're essentially paying 2 life and 4 mana for a 3/4 lifelinker, which just isn't that good. Next, we have Mana Gorge or Phoenix, red for a creature Phoenix, 2/2 with flying, and it can't block. Whenever you cast a spell, if it's in your graveyard, put a flame counter on it. Put a flame counter on it for each red in that spell's mana cost. If Mana Gorge or Phoenix has 5 or more flame counters on it, return it to the battlefield. It perpetually gets +1/+1. So essentially, every 5 devotion, you cast, this thing comes back. I think this could actually see a lot of play in like mono red rush. I mean, it's a 2/2 for 2 with flying, which isn't awful. It's going to be able to attack almost every turn. And then you're going to cast lots of little stuff. Little stuff often has high red devotion because if you're casting a 1-drop, it's going to have 100% of the mana you spend has a red. And then this thing can just keep coming back and it keeps coming back bigger. So I think mono red rush might really like this, or mono red aggro. Reckless Ringleader, 1 red for a creature Goblin Rogue, 1/1 with haste, and when it enters the battlefield, choose a creature card in your hand, it perpetually gains haste, so it's essentially the haste version of it. But I do think this one is actually better than a lot of the other ones, because it's a Goblin. 1/1 Goblin with haste, not bad, and then the fact that you can give another one of your Goblins haste, not bad, and then also, you might just want this in a mono red deck, a 1/1 for 1 with haste, we don't necessarily have too many of those. And then you can also then give your creatures haste. So I actually think mono red might actually enjoy this card more than the other colors are going to like theirs. Next, we have Sarkin Scorn. It's a 3-cost red instant. It deals damage equal to the number of turns you have begun to target creature or planeswalker. So essentially, the reason this is worded weird is because it counts the turn you're on. So if you cast this on turn 3, it's going to deal 3 damage. If you cast this on turn 4, it's going to deal 4. What I really like about this card is that later in the game, it's going to deal more damage when there are bigger threats with higher toughness. Earlier in the game, it's going to deal less damage. And oftentimes when you think about it, turn 3, people are going to have 3 mana, meaning they're going to be playing 3 toughness creatures. You know, yes, you can ramp ahead, and that is where kind of this card sees its downfall a little bit. But I do think this card's actually going to be a really good removal, especially for something like Historic Brawl, because oftentimes you are paying, the same amount of mana as something has toughness, and you're paying mana equal to the number of turns that have happened, if you understand what I'm saying. So I actually think this is oftentimes going to just be able to kill anything on the board. So I think it's really, really good. Next, we have Sarkin, Wanderer to Shiv. It is 4 mana for a red legendary planeswalker Sarkin. You can +1 it and dragons cards in your hand. Gain this spell cost 1 less to cast, and you may pay X rather than spend this spell's mana cost, where X is its mana value. Okay, so that's a little bit of a weird wording, but essentially, if you have a dragon that costs 4 red, instead it just costs 6 generic mana. But also this spell costs 1 less to cast, so now it costs 5, then 4, then 3, then 2, then 1. So essentially, the longer this thing stays alive, the cheaper your dragons in your hand are going to be. It's perpetual, meaning if they get bounced or put in the graveyard or in your library, they're going to remember that they're that cheap. So it's really, really good. I'm sure there's some weird combo-y stuff you can do with this, but yeah, this seems really, really powerful to me in those dragon-based decks. We did just get a bunch of dragons. For instance, Tiamat no longer costs Wooburg. It's just 7 mana, and it's actually then 6, and then 5, and then 4, and then you're going to get a bunch of dragons that all then get cheaper. So in a Tiamat deck, Sarkin definitely fits in there. Then you can 0 to conjure a Shivan Dragon card into your hand. 0, essentially draw a card. Not bad, so drawing a card every turn. -2, it deals 3 damage to target creature, so then it also has removal. Honestly, if you have any form of dragon deck that has red, put this in it. That's just kind of my opinion, and it seems really, really good. That cost reduction is saving you mana, the 0 is getting you card advantage, and the minus is removal, and those are kind of the 3 biggest things in Magic, is removal, card draw, and mana ramp. And Shivan Dragon, by the way, 6-drop, 5/5 flyer that has fire breathing. Next, we have Cyan of Shiv, 4 cost, 3/3, flying dragon. You can pay 3 mana, it perpetually gets +1/+0, so it's essentially expensive fire breathing that lasts forever. Cool. Next, we have Static Discharge, 1 in a red for a sorcery. Static Discharge deals 3 damage to any target, where X is 3 plus the number of charge counters on Static Discharge. Then put a perpetual charge counter on this card, and each card named Static Discharge in your hand, library, and graveyard. So essentially, if you're running 4 of these in a deck, the first time you cast it, it's 3 to target creature. No, to any target. Actually, not bad. 3 mana to any target for 2 mana. 3 damage to any target for 2 mana. It's sorcery speed, which is the big downside. But then the next time you cast it, it's 4 damage, and then 5, and then 6. So I actually think a burn deck might like this. It's another burn spell. It's going to get better and better as the game goes on. And then if you're in a deck that can recur this, from your graveyard and keep recasting it, it means you are going to be putting charge counters on this thing, and it could eventually do like 9 damage in 1 hit. So I think if you're running a deck that recurs things, or just like a burn deck, this card could be good for you. Next, we have Freya Lee's 3 cost, 4 loyalty, legendary planeswalker Freya Lee's. You can +1 and up to 1 target elf, or untap up to 1 target elf. That elf and a random elf creature card in your hand perpetually get +1/+1. So you're basically boosting your stuff on your board and untapping for 3 mana. That's crazy, because elves generate lots of mana and get bigger, and like getting bigger, and often give you more mana for getting bigger. So that's really crazy. -1, seek an elf card, so you get a random elf from your library into your hand. And then -6, conjure a Regal Force card, which is then going to draw you cards equal to the number of green creatures you control, which, by the way, is going to be a lot because you're an elf deck. Honestly, historic elf decks are already pretty good, and this is going to be an auto-include. Next, we have Longtest Stalker, 1 cost, 1/1. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, you get an energy counter. You can pay 2 energy counter, and it perpetually gets +1/+0. You may choose a creature card in your hand. If you do, that card gets +1/+0. So essentially, you're boosting it and a creature in your hand for 2 mana. Honestly, not awful. You know, it costs 1 mana. You're probably playing it turn 1. Then turn 2, you attack with it. In response to the attack, you get the counter. Then you essentially pay the 2 energy counters, and essentially you have a 1 cost 2/1, and you boosted something in your hand. So I think a mono green, really aggressive deck is going to like this. Essentially, every other turn it gets more and more power, and you're boosting other stuff in your hand. So I think mono green kind of aggro decks, which don't super exist, could like this. Pool of Vigorous Growth. Okay, this one's interesting. It's 1 and a green for an artifact, and you can pay X and tap, and also discard a card, so that's a pretty big cost, to create a token that's a copy of a random creature card with mana value X. Activate only as a sorcery. So if I'm understanding this, this is essentially the Mothervig Emblem, which essentially lets you do that. It essentially takes a random card from all of Magic and just puts it on the battlefield under your control. Surprised it's not using Conjure. Honestly, was expecting that. But yeah, so this is going to take you pay 3 mana, you are getting a 3, mana card from that's on MTG Arena. And essentially you're discarding a card from your hand to do that. So you're essentially turning the card you discarded into a random card, which by the way, this works really well with any of the cards that let you conjure stuff to your hand, because then you discard it immediately and just turn it into something cool or something bad. So this is gonna be very luck dependent. I kind of wish this was a legendary creature just so that you could run it as your commander, and I feel like that'd be really fun. Or God forbid, maybe make this a companion, just so you could have those fun decks that are built around it, because it is going to be very luck heavy and gimmicky. You could pay 2 mana and get something garbage, or you could pay 2 mana and get something really great, or even go up to 7 mana. I think this card is actually really, really good, just because if it kind of fixes you. If you end up drawing lands when you don't need them, you can turn them into creatures. If you draw the wrong creature, it essentially says if you're top decking or don't have the right answer, it gives you hope that you might. Kind of reminds me of Vivian's Arcbow a little bit, which does something very similar, but it does stuff with your library. So I really like it. Next, we have Shroud Ambush, 1 and a green for an instant. Target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. When the creature you control wins the fight, draw a card. I have no idea what constitutes winning a fight. Is it killing the other creature and surviving? Is it just killing the other creature? I'm not sure, but if it's just killing the other creature, this seems pretty good. Instant speed fight that lets you replace itself. That seems pretty great to me. Gonna see lots of playing Historic Brawl and probably even play a normal Historic. Shroud Lookout, 1 and a green for a creature elf archer, 1/1 with reach, and when it enters the battlefield, seek an elf. Alright, more elf support, essentially a cantripping elf. Veteran Charger, 3 mana for a green creature centaur soldier, 2/2, and when it enters the battlefield, choose a creature card in your hand. It perpetually gets +2/+2. Not a big fan of this one, kind of just meh. And then Faceless Agent, a 3-cost creature shapeshifter, 2/1, it's colorless, that's a changeling, so every color now has this changeling, which is pretty cool. When it DTBs, seek a creature card of the most prevalent creature type in your library. So essentially, this thing is a cantripping 2/1 that has all creature types, and it's going to go get whatever the most prevalent creature type is. So essentially, you're going to put this in a tribal deck, and any tribal deck now has a cantripping creature of the tribal that they're playing that goes and gets another of that type. Seems really good. I think a lot of tribal decks are actually going to want this. It is a little bit random, but like in those, more expensive base tribal decks, for instance, dragons, a 3 mana dragon's pretty good, especially when that 3 mana dragon goes and gets you another dragon. So that is it for all of the cards. There were a lot of interesting ones. Some of them were a little bit more boring, and I know this video has been long, so I'm going to try and keep this part a little bit shorter. I'm really excited for Historic Horizons. I want to know what you guys' favorite mechanic is or favorite card is in the comments down below. If you enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.